When a lavish hotel's unyielding manager denies entry to a weathered veteran, nobody expects the unforgettable revelation that follows. Brace yourself for an extraordinary turn of events that proves kindness can come from the most unexpected places and change lives forever. But before we dive in, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story speaks to you, hit that subscribe button for more amazing stories. The opulent lobby of the Silver Crest luxury hotel glittered under the light of its cascading crystal chandeliers. A grand piano in the corner played soft jazz, complementing the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Guests arrived by sleek limousines, stepping onto marble floors polished to a mirror-like shine. Staff in impeccable uniforms moved briskly across the lobby, ensuring every detail was flawlessly managed, from the fresh orchids in crystal vases to the chilled towels offered at check-in. Behind the mahogany front desk stood Martin Rycroft, the hotel's renowned manager. Tall, with meticulously groomed silver hair, Martin was known for his unwavering dedication to maintaining the hotel's lavish reputation. He never accepted anything less than perfection, from his staff or from the clientele. Tonight, as a crowd of sophisticated guests milled about, Martin's posture was especially straight, his gaze keen. A prestigious event was scheduled for the evening, a high-profile charity gala. CEOs, celebrities, and dignitaries were all expected, and Martin was determined that every second would unfold without a hitch. The usual pre-event excitement buzzed in the air. A socialite in an evening gown asked for assistance with her suite. A movie producer requested an upgrade to the penthouse. The staff dutifully attended each request with a polite nod and a gracious smile. Martin oversaw the process, ensuring every need was met swiftly and elegantly. His reputation as an impeccable host was unmatched. Suddenly, amid the swirl of tuxedos and designer dresses, a lone figure entered the lobby. At first glance, the newcomer seemed out of place. His hair, silver like Martin's but worn short, spoke of years of experience. He wore a worn-out bomber jacket adorned with an embroidered patch on the left side, a small American flag. The man's shoulders were broad yet slumped, as if carrying the weight of memories too heavy to set down. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, possibly a reservation confirmation. Despite the crowd of stylish guests, the man's presence drew subtle, curious stares. Some recognized the signature patches on his jacket, medals that once glimmered with pride. Others simply saw an older man in scuffed shoes and wrinkled clothes, clearly mismatched against the hotel's shimmering surroundings. His name was Colonel James Monroe, a veteran who had served 3 tours of duty overseas. He had come to the Silver Crest with a specific purpose, one that had been decades in the making. But the hush that fell over the lobby as he approached the front desk was thick with uncertainty. No one quite knew what to make of this solitary figure, who carried himself with a quiet dignity that transcended fashion or wealth. The tension peaked when Martin Rycroft caught sight of him. An instinctive flicker of disapproval crossed the manager's face. After all, Martin's entire career revolved around curating an environment of refined exclusivity, and Colonel Monroe, with his beat-up bag and time-worn coat, looked like a ripple in an otherwise placid pond. "Good evening," the veteran said softly, placing the crumpled paper on the desk. "I have a reservation, or at least I think I do." He offered a polite, tentative smile. Martin examined the paper with an almost imperceptible furrow of his brow. A series of quick keystrokes on the computer followed. "I'm sorry," Martin began, his voice cool and practiced. "I don't see your name in our system." The manager lifted his eyes, scanning the older man from head to toe. "Are you sure you booked here?" A slight flush colored Colonel Monroe's cheeks. "Yes, my granddaughter made the reservation online," he explained. "She said she wanted me to have the best experience. I've never stayed in a place quite like this." A few onlookers in the lobby exchanged glances. The distant tinkle of piano music underscored the tension that was now palpable. Martin's eyes narrowed, and his disapproval solidified into a polite but unyielding stance. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," he said, voice measured. "The Silver Crest has very strict standards. If your reservation can't be confirmed, I'm afraid I can't." Before he could finish, Colonel Monroe gently slid an ID card across the desk. It bore insignia from his time in service. "Could you check again?" he asked quietly. Maybe my granddaughter used my middle name. In that moment, a brief flicker of recognition passed over Martin's features. But whatever it was, he concealed it quickly behind a mask of professional detachment. Little did anyone know, the revelation about to unravel would not only shake the foundations of the Silver Crest, but also touch every soul who walked through its doors that night. No one suspected the chain of events that one small decision, one act of denial, was about to set into motion. On a normal evening, Martin would have handled the situation with discreet courtesy, perhaps calling a staff member aside to verify the reservation behind closed doors. Tonight, however, a subtle edge sharpened his demeanor. The celebrity-laden gala was only an hour away, and he couldn't afford any complications. He barely glanced at the colonel's military ID before sliding it back. "I'm sorry, sir," Martin stated, his voice tight, "but we have no record of you. Our suites are fully booked, and I'm afraid we can't accommodate walk-ins tonight." A hush fell over the onlookers. Even the pianist stumbled over a note, as if reacting to the sudden tension. Colonel Monroe's face fell, a mix of disappointment and lingering hope. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a folded letter. "My granddaughter wrote the confirmation number here. Could you try this?" Martin cast a glance at the letter but did not reach for it. "As I said, sir, we are fully booked for the evening. I must ask you to step aside. Other guests need to check in." A few in the crowd watched with stunned expressions. An older couple near the velvet settees exchanged looks of disbelief. A group of elegantly dressed gala attendees raised eyebrows at the manager's curt tone. The colonel, to his credit, kept his composure. His eyes held a dignified sadness, as though he'd encountered far graver challenges in life than a denied hotel reservation. Just as Martin turned to greet another guest, a soft, hesitant voice spoke up. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice you're having trouble." A young bellhop named Daniel stepped forward, glancing at Colonel Monroe. Daniel was new to the hotel, still in training, and he'd never seen Martin act so dismissively. "If you'd like, I can try to check the system one more time." Martin shot Daniel a sharp look. "Don't worry about it," he said tersely. "I have the situation under control." But Colonel Monroe's posture remained resolute. He gently unfolded the letter and placed it on the counter. "Please, just look at this confirmation number." His voice carried a note of quiet insistence. "I'm sorry," Martin reiterated, sliding the letter back toward the veteran without reading it. "I can't help you." The onlookers felt a knot tightening in the room. The colonel sighed, resignation evident in his eyes, and quietly gathered his belongings. He dipped his head in a show of gratitude to those who had watched. "I appreciate your time," he said softly, turning away from the front desk. All around the lobby, tension rippled. It wasn't often that a guest, especially one wearing a jacket adorned with service medals, was outright refused at the Silver Crest. Whispers began among the elegantly dressed patrons. Some murmured about the shame of turning away a veteran. Others wondered if Martin had a justifiable reason. Daniel the bellhop watched the colonel's retreating figure, conflict evident in his young eyes. He hesitated a moment, then quietly followed the older man toward the entrance. In his mind, a single question burned. Why would a top-tier manager like Martin, known for his perfect courtesy, be so unyielding in this one case? Outside, the night air was crisp. A swirl of city lights reflected off the luxurious cars parked under the hotel's grand canopy. Colonel Monroe stood under one of the decorative lanterns, scanning his letter under the dim glow. He looked almost lost. Daniel approached cautiously, wanting to help but unsure how to proceed. "Sir," he said softly, "if you give me just a few minutes, I can speak with our reservations team and try to find a solution. I know we're busy tonight, but there might be a last-minute cancellation or something we can do." The colonel regarded Daniel with a gentle smile. "I appreciate that, son, but I don't want to cause any trouble. I'm sure Mr. Rycroft knows what he's doing." Daniel felt a pang of sympathy. Glancing back through the glass doors, he saw Martin resuming his impeccable welcome for other guests. His posture was as straight as ever, eyes scanning for any sign of imperfection in the lobby. Daniel wondered what could possibly motivate such a cold refusal toward a man who had served his country. What no one realized yet was that Martin's reasons went far deeper than a missing reservation. A single memory from Martin's past, something he'd kept hidden, had jolted to life the moment he saw the colonel's jacket. And that memory would soon shake not just Martin, but the entire hotel to its core. Back inside the Silver Crest, the grand piano resumed its gentle tune. Guests continued to check in, their excitement for the upcoming gala overshadowing the uneasy incident that had just occurred. Martin meticulously ran through his mental checklist. Flowers for the VIP tables, additional staff stationed near the ballroom, security protocols in place. Yet he couldn't shake the lingering tension in the air. He glanced around, noticing how several guests still wore puzzled or disapproving expressions. Even a few of his longtime staff members seemed uncomfortable. He pretended not to see their questioning looks, focusing instead on the task at hand. Then, as if compelled by an invisible force, Martin found himself pacing toward the lounge area, tucked just behind the main lobby. He needed a moment of quiet, a chance to refocus. The lounge was dimly lit, with plush armchairs and discreet lighting, casting a warm glow on the mahogany tables. It was here that he heard a hushed conversation. Daniel the bellhop stood with an older housekeeper named Maria. Their voices were low, but Martin could just make out the topic of discussion. The Colonel. "I feel terrible," Daniel murmured. "He's a veteran, for crying out loud. We should have at least checked for a mistake in the system." Maria sighed. "I've worked here for 20 years, and Mr. Rycroft has never acted that way before. Did you see his face? It was like he recognized the Colonel, but something stopped him from helping." "I don't understand." Martin froze in the shadows, listening. A flash of guilt tightened his chest, but he forced the feeling away. Straightening his jacket, he stepped forward. "Back to work, both of you," he said quietly, his voice firm. Startled, Daniel and Maria whirled around. They immediately stood upright, stammering apologies. Martin simply nodded, his expression unreadable. The two staff members hurried off, leaving him alone in the lounge. He sank into one of the armchairs, a swirl of memories threatening to overcome him. Years ago, long before he became manager of the Silver Crest, Martin had worn a uniform too, but the memory was painful, tangled in regret and fear. Something about Colonel Monroe's appearance had triggered an old wound, one Martin had worked tirelessly to bury under a persona of cool professionalism. Now the sight of that bomber jacket, those medals, had cracked open the past. He closed his eyes, remembering a night in a military infirmary overseas. He was just a young soldier then, scared, unsure, struggling with an injury that almost cost him his life. When he reopened his eyes, he blinked away the old ghosts. There was no space for personal turmoil tonight. The gala demanded perfection, yet a voice in his mind wouldn't let him rest. "You could have handled that better." Out in the lobby, the atmosphere grew lively again. The event planner arrived, fussing over seating charts. A wealthy heiress insisted on a suite with a panoramic city view. The red carpet photographers began setting up near the main entrance. And in the midst of it all, Colonel Monroe still hadn't left the premises. He lingered outside, pacing near a marble pillar. From time to time, curious guests would glance at him through the glass doors, their expressions wavering between sympathy and confusion. Unbeknownst to Martin or anyone else, the Colonel had a reason for not leaving, a reason that would soon set off a chain reaction of revelations, regrets, and the most heartwarming twists the Silver Crest had ever witnessed. As Martin stood, smoothing out his suit jacket to resume his duties, he thought he spotted the Colonel just beyond the entrance. Their eyes met briefly, but Martin turned away, refusing to acknowledge the pang in his chest. He had come too far to let an old memory unravel him now. If only he knew that the storm gathering around his conscience was about to break wide open, and that he would soon face a choice that would determine not only Colonel Monroe's fate, but his own. The clock struck 7 p.m., and the grand ballroom opened its doors for the charity gala. Ornate candelabras lined the tables, and glittering centerpieces adorned with fresh orchids cast dancing reflections across the polished floors. Dignitaries and socialites, dressed in their finest gowns and tuxedos, filled the room with soft chatter. Servers glided among them, offering gourmet hors d'oeuvres and the finest champagne. Amid this scene of luxury, Martin Rycroft struggled to maintain his composure. He circulated among the guests, greeting them with a formal smile and overseeing every detail. Yet every so often his gaze drifted toward the lobby where he'd last seen Colonel Monroe. Finally, during a lull in the festivities, Martin slipped away from the ballroom. He headed toward the side corridor near the hotel's entrance, only to find a small crowd gathered around Daniel. The young bellhop was explaining something in hushed tones. A sympathetic murmur spread among the listeners. Martin approached, his expression cautious. He cleared his throat, and the small group parted, revealing Colonel Monroe standing awkwardly near a wall adorned with framed photographs of past VIP guests. In the colonel's hand was the same letter, the same crumpled piece of paper he had shown before. "I'm sorry for the disturbance," Colonel Monroe said, shifting on his feet. "I just needed to confirm one last time. My granddaughter insisted I had a room booked here." One of the guests, a middle-aged man with a philanthropic spirit, overheard and walked over. "Excuse me," he said to Martin, "but if this gentleman is indeed a veteran and there's just been a mix-up, perhaps you could arrange some accommodation for him. I'd be willing to sponsor his stay." Martin stiffened, forcing a smile. "That's very generous, sir, but our policy—" Before he could finish, the older housekeeper, Maria, appeared with a determined glint in her eye. "I checked the booking records, Mr. Rycroft," she said quietly, handing him a printout. "It seems there was a reservation under James M. Monroe. It was canceled 2 days ago by someone on our staff, but not by the colonel or his granddaughter." A ripple of shock passed through the group. Colonel Monroe blinked, surprise and confusion etched on his face. Martin took a moment to study the document. His jaw tightened. "This must be a mistake," he said, but his voice wavered. The philanthropic guest frowned. "A canceled reservation? That's strange." Daniel spoke up, eyes darting between Martin and the colonel. "Could it have been a system error? Or maybe someone canceled it by accident?" For a moment, Martin said nothing. His gaze locked onto the printed sheet, the official record that contradicted his earlier assertion. He glanced up, meeting Colonel Monroe's eyes. Something in the colonel's gaze, patient, understanding, yet tinged with disappointment, made Martin's heart twist. "All right," Martin finally said, his voice measured. "There seems to have been an error. Colonel Monroe, let me see what I can do." Relief spread across the colonel's face, and a small ripple of applause came from a few onlookers who had been following the drama. But even as Martin gestured for the colonel to come back inside, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Why had that reservation been canceled? And why had Martin been so resistant to checking in the first place? As they walked back toward the front desk, an unexpected hush enveloped the lobby. The shimmering chandeliers seemed to pulse with silent anticipation, as though they, too, awaited the resolution of this strangely charged encounter. Little did anyone realize that the truth about Colonel Monroe and Martin's past was not just about a booking error. Something deeper and far more personal tied these two men together, a connection that would soon be revealed beneath the very chandeliers that watched over them. Stepping behind the front desk, Martin typed quickly into the computer, verifying the newly discovered cancellation records. Colonel Monroe stood at a respectful distance, the letter in his hand trembling ever so slightly. Daniel and Maria hovered close, their eyes flickering between the screen and the colonel, waiting for the final word. After a tense silence, Martin glanced at the colonel. "I can arrange a suite for you now," he offered. "It seems your reservation was indeed canceled by mistake. On behalf of the Silver Crest, I apologize for the inconvenience." A wave of relief washed over Colonel Monroe's features. He drew in a breath, as though he'd been holding it this entire time. "Thank you," he replied softly, his dignity intact despite the earlier humiliation. "But if it's too much trouble, I'll be fine with any room you have available." Martin shook his head. "No trouble at all," he insisted, though his voice carried an undercurrent of strain. The watchers, guests and staff alike, felt a collective sense of resolution starting to form. Yet something still hovered in the air, an unspoken question that no one knew how to articulate. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, Colonel Monroe cleared his throat. "Mr. Rycroft," he said gently, "I think we've met before." A hush fell so profound, one could almost hear the faint hum of the hotel's air conditioning. Martin's face went rigid, his eyes flickering with recognition he had tried so hard to bury. Slowly, the colonel reached into the inner pocket of his bomber jacket and pulled out a creased photograph. He held it out for Martin to see. The photo was of a younger Martin, pale and bandaged, lying in a makeshift military infirmary. Beside him was a uniformed figure wearing a name tag that read J. Monroe. The colonel in the photo had fewer gray hairs, but the determined set of his jaw and the compassion in his eyes were unmistakable. A collective gasp swept through the small crowd that had gathered to watch. Daniel's mouth fell open. Maria put a hand to her chest. The philanthropic guest, still standing by the front desk, seemed momentarily stunned. Martin's shoulders slumped, as though the weight of 1,000 regrets pressed down on him. I I remember, he admitted, voice breaking slightly. It was a long time ago. Colonel Monroe nodded, his gaze steady. We were pinned down by enemy fire, and you got hit bad. I was part of the unit that got you out. I never forgot the look on your face that day, or how grateful you were when I carried you to the evacuation helicopter. Silence filled the lobby, thicker than any tension had been before. Even the distant music from the ballroom seemed to fade away, as if giving the two men space to confront their intertwined past. I came here not just for a room, Colonel Monroe continued, but because my granddaughter found out you were the manager at this hotel. I wanted to see you, to see if you'd made it through and found a good life. I'm proud you did. Martin felt a prickling behind his eyes, tears he didn't dare shed in front of so many. Memories he'd buried, a time of fear, pain, and gratitude, rushed back in vivid detail. He remembered the colonel's unwavering bravery, the way he'd risked his own safety to save a wounded soldier he barely knew. Martin began, unsure how to bridge the chasm between them. A wave of shame washed over him as he recalled his earlier refusal. He realized with painful clarity that he had not simply denied a reservation. He had denied a man who had once saved his life. Guests and staff alike stood in silent awe, some wiping away tears. The moral weight of the moment was palpable. The colonel's kindness and selflessness decades ago contrasted starkly with Martin's recent cold dismissal. Finally, Martin stepped from behind the desk, extended his hand, and said, "Thank you for everything." Colonel Monroe clasped Martin's hand in a firm shake, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "We all do what we can for each other," he replied. A ripple of applause broke out among the onlookers. Some filmed the encounter on their phones. Others simply watched with shining eyes. It was clear this was more than just a routine scene in a luxury hotel. It was a moment of profound humanity, a reminder that behind wealth and status, we are all simply people with intertwined stories. Yet the story doesn't end here. Even as Martin escorted Colonel Monroe to a suite that night, insisting he take one of the most luxurious rooms, free of charge, a new chapter was waiting to unfold. The colonel had come not only to reunite with a memory, but to share one final surprise, a secret he'd guarded for years, one that would leave everyone speechless and redefine both his life and Martin's forever. Late that night, after the hustle of the gala wound down and the last of the champagne flutes clinked in farewell, the Silver Crest corridors fell quiet. A sense of relief mixed with curiosity lingered among the staff, who all sensed something momentous had happened. Martin Rycroft escorted Colonel James Monroe to the top floor, personally unlocking one of the hotel's premier suites. The lavish room featured a sitting area with plush velvet couches, a marble fireplace, and grand windows overlooking the city skyline. Faint golden light from the lamp danced off crystal decanters and mirrored surfaces, enhancing the air of understated opulence. The colonel walked in slowly, his eyes drifting across the surroundings. Despite the grandeur, his gaze carried a subdued awe, as if still adjusting to how drastically the evening had changed. A moment passed before Martin cleared his throat. "I realize now how wrong I was," he confessed in a quiet voice. "Turning you away was inexcusable. I can't even begin to repay what you did for me all those years ago." Colonel Monroe rested his hand gently on Martin's shoulder. "You were young and scared back then. We all were. Sometimes fear follows us even after we leave the battlefield. It's an old companion that never truly goes away. Tonight, I saw that fear in your eyes again." Martin swallowed hard, remembering the dusty roads and scorching sun from a place he preferred not to revisit. "I thought I'd put all that behind me, built a new life here, away from everything that hurt." Softly, the colonel nodded. Then he held up the folded photo once more, studying it under the lamp's glow. I didn't want to show this to you in front of everyone, he began, carefully extracting a small envelope from his jacket pocket. My granddaughter found this letter from a man named Michael Friedman. He was your commanding officer. He wrote it years ago. A flicker of recognition crossed Martin's face. Captain Friedman, he whispered. He was the one who recommended me for a medical discharge. I never knew why. Colonel Monroe handed him the envelope. It turns out Friedman was more than just your CO. He was connected to a foundation that helps veterans start new careers after service. In the letter, he mentions that a private donor covered your therapy costs and helped fund your first internship in hotel management. Martin's hands shook as he held the letter, which bore a faded official seal. I always thought the department handled it, or that it was just the standard benefits. The colonel exhaled slowly. It wasn't. The donor wanted to remain anonymous, but Friedman's letter reveals the truth. It was me. For several moments, Martin stood there stunned by this second revelation. You paid for my therapy? My training? But how did I never... A small smile tugged at the colonel's lips. You'd already left base by then, and I had your discharge paperwork. I knew you were proud and wouldn't accept charity, but I also knew you needed that chance. So I pulled a few strings. Emotions swirled in Martin's chest. Gratitude, guilt, relief, and something else that felt a lot like humility. I don't know what to say, he finally managed. You saved my life twice. Colonel Monroe set a comforting hand on Martin's shoulder again. All I ever wanted was for you to be okay. Seeing you succeed here, even with tonight's rocky start, it tells me I made the right choice. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling beyond the window. Martin felt the weight of his earlier actions and the deeper debt of gratitude he now owed. With trembling resolve, he realized that an apology, no matter how heartfelt, might never be enough. But there was still time to make things right. More than that, to do something that would honor the colonel's unspoken generosity and unconditional kindness. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the Silver Crest changed in ways no one could have foreseen. Word of Colonel Monroe's identity and the heartwarming bond he shared with Martin had spread among the staff. From the bellhops to the servers, everyone treated the colonel like an honored guest who, in a very real sense, belonged there. Martin woke early, restless with a new sense of purpose. He had arranged a private breakfast meeting in one of the small conference rooms adjacent to the dining hall. The staff, eager to atone for the initial denial, laid out a lavish spread. Freshly baked croissants, fruit platters, hot coffee, and an array of pastries. Soft morning light filtered through the curtains, highlighting the colonel's weathered features as he settled into a chair. Across from him sat Martin, the letter from Captain Friedman neatly folded on the table. He had barely slept, wrestling with how to repay such selfless acts. I asked you here because I have a proposal, Martin began, his tone sincere but slightly uncertain. Colonel Monroe looked up, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. Son, you don't owe me anything. I never did this to be repaid. Martin nodded, hands folded. I know, but I also know there are countless veterans out there who need what you gave me, a chance. I've spoken to our hotel's board of directors, and they've agreed to help me start a program. We'll partner with local veteran organizations to provide vocational training and discounted lodging for those transitioning back into civilian life. A quiet hush fell over the table. The colonel's lips parted in surprised admiration. You do that? Not just me. Everyone here wants to be part of this. And I want you to be our honorary advisor, if you're willing. Your experience and perspective could guide us to help more people effectively. For a moment, the colonel was at a loss for words. Then a warm smile lit his features, softening the lines on his face. I'd be honored, he said simply, his voice catching slightly. Emotions flickered in Martin's eyes, the weight of gratitude making his words come slowly. I know it can't erase what happened last night or what you did for me all those years ago, but I hope it shows how much I appreciate the gift you've given me and how I intend to pay it forward. Colonel Monroe reached across the table and clasped Martin's hand. Their surroundings fell away, leaving them in that quiet space of mutual understanding. In that moment, it was clear that a new chapter was beginning, not just for them, but for everyone who walked through the Silver Crest's ornate doors. Soon after, staff members and even some of the gala attendees gathered in the conference room, eager to learn more about the new veteran outreach program. Their presence felt like a promise that each of them would do their part to uphold the ideals Colonel Monroe had fought for and that Martin had almost forgotten. As the colonel shared stories from his service, the group listened with respect and rapt attention. Martin stood at the edge of the room, seeing how far he had come, from a wounded soldier in a dusty infirmary to a hotel manager with the power to change lives. The colonel's tale of duty and sacrifice resonated in the gilded walls of the Silver Crest, reshaping its definition of luxury into something deeper: compassion, generosity, and second chances. In the end, as the sun climbed higher over the city, Martin and Colonel Monroe stood side by side in the grand lobby. Crystal chandeliers glittered above them, as if reflecting the bright future they were now building together. The colonel's presence no longer felt like an interruption to the Silver Crest's polished world. It was an essential reminder that behind every polished surface, a story of humanity waits to be told. Tears welled in Martin's eyes as he said goodbye to the colonel before his departure. But this time, the parting was marked by respect and admiration, not regret. A hush fell over guests and staff alike as they watched the two men exchange a final handshake, embodying the bond they'd forged through kindness and redemption. Colonel Monroe paused at the doors, casting one more look around the lobby that had once felt so unwelcoming. With a slight nod, he stepped into the city beyond, leaving behind the promise of something greater than a mere hotel stay. He left a legacy, proof that a single moment of compassion can resonate across lifetimes. And so the story ends, with lessons learned and hearts changed forever. The Silver Crest would never be the same. Neither would Martin Rycroft, nor the countless veterans whose lives would soon be touched by the new program. Because sometimes one act of kindness, or one unwarranted denial, can rewrite destinies in ways no one sees coming.